Devar Torah today will be given by Jacob Teskey.
Good Shabbos, everyone. All right, when I put this together, I prayed to God that I wouldn't embarrass myself, but it seems like I'm too late because while I did write a Devar about the right Parsha, we skipped the part that I wrote about. So, it's my Devar, I'm sticking to it. So, all right, so if y'all have been following along in your Chumash, I'm sure that everyone's noticed that there's a lot going on here. From Avram's journeys to the foreshadowing with Lot when he leaves to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, the birth of Ishmael to the commandment of circumcision. This is a very, very dense parsha. And I don't want to keep you all here forever. I really want to zero in on the first two aliyot, starting with the first words of significance, Lech-Lecha. Now, this is usually translated as something like go forth or get out or even leave, depending on how the translator feels about whether or not God had his morning coffee before talking to Avram. So, a direct translation of the Hebrew is tricky. Lech-Lecha literally means something like go, you're going. Which sounds awkward in English, but a direct Hebrew translation always does, since the language has no copular verb to be. If we took that translation approach, every bracha would start out like, bless you, God, king the world, as if God just sneezed while playing checkers with the planets. I personally like the meaning of go and bring yourself. God tells Avram to go and bring himself out of his native land into the land that God will show him. So Avram brings himself around the land of Canaan, builds an altar near Bethel, goes through the Negev desert, crosses the Egyptian border because there's no food, there's a famine, and what's the first thing he does when he arrives in Egypt? He lies! Not only does he lie, he convinces Sarah to go along with this lie. Presumably, he also convinces a bunch of other people, since it says he brought a whole gaggle of servants with him, so now they're having to cover up for their boss. All because Avram doesn't trust the Egyptians, and he's become convinced that if word gets out he and Sarah are married, Sarah is so beautiful that some duplicitous Egyptian will kill him and kidnap her. So he spins this whole yarn about Sarah being his sister. But when Avram arrives in Egypt, he's greeted with tremendous hospitality. The Pharaoh himself takes him in and gives them tons of lavish gifts. Everything is gravy, and they're living up in the palace. Pharaoh takes notice of the nice unmarried woman and thinks she'd make a nice concubine. This was the Bronze Age. And this offends God so much that a bunch of plagues are unleashed upon the palace. And when the truth finally gets out, Pharaoh asks, Mazot asitali, lama lo higatali ki ishatcha hi. Why did you do this to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Avram and Sarah and all their servants are then kicked out of the palace and have to hit the road again. So what's the deeper lesson in this text? Sure, don't lie to people, that's obvious, especially not about your wife being your sister. That's just a weird thing to lie about. But what are the spiritual consequences to all this? So let's look at the reason Avram lied in the first place. It's the same reason I think most of us lie. He was afraid. He was afraid of what other people would do in a situation he completely fabricated in his head. I think back, Lech-Lecha, go and bring yourself. Avram brought his body into Egypt, sure, but himself, his story, his life, the truth, he left that all back in the Negev desert. We see this theme crop up time and time again in our scripture, where using deceit out of fear or shame leads to much worse consequences than the truth. In Tractate Pesachim 113b in the Talmud, the Gemara states, the Holy One, Baruch Hu, hates three people: one who says one statement with his mouth and means another in his heart, one who knows testimony about another person but does not testify in their behalf, and one who observes a licentious matter performed by another person and testifies alone merely to ruin their reputation. In short, liars, cowards, and gossipers. Probably the most famous example in the Tanakh of someone making something infinitely worse by trying to cover up what they did out of fear and shame is King David's affair with Bathsheba, We all know the Leonard Cohen song, "Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof, her beauty and the moonlight overthrew ya." We use the tune for Psalm 150. The king has an affair with the wife of one of his soldiers. She gets pregnant, and to hide his own shame, he sends Uriah, her husband, to the front lines, trying to get him killed. And what I find interesting is that we don't hear what God thinks of this whole situation until Bathsheba has finished sitting Shiva for her husband. And I like to think that up until that point, David could have done teshuvah, could have made this right, but chose not to. He could have come clean with Bathsheba, said she was pregnant, but no. He could have come clean when Uriah talked with him outside the palace, but no. He could have come clean when he was out drinking with Uriah, but no. He could have called off this whole crazy plan to get Uriah killed before things got ugly, but he chose not to and got Uriah and who knows how many other people killed. And while Bathsheba was grieving her dead husband, David kept it from her, and he was responsible for Uriah's death, the woman that he wanted to be with so badly he committed an indirect murder and held on to this deceit so that he can marry her himself. And that's when the text finally says, "Vayera hadavar asher asa David be'enei Hashem." David had done an evil deed in the eyes of God. When someone has a stroke, oftentimes the free exchange of information between neurons is cut off and leaves someone with a permanent mental or physical disability. Sometimes it ends up paralyzing a person, or they lose the ability to see or to read and write. Deceit acts like blood clots in the large brain we call society. Just as Avram's deceit destroyed the bonds of trust between himself and the Pharaoh, withholding information, refusing to bring ourselves to the conversation weakens us as a community and a society as large. They don't need to be large acts of dishonesty, like covering up a murder or telling the Pharaoh your wife is your sister. You know, how many of us have withheld our religious practices from our employers because we're afraid we might be fired or passed up for promotion, or taking too many days off? How many of us have withheld our true feelings about the state of the world because we're afraid of losing the respect of people around us? And I'm not saying this to pass judgment. I've probably done it just as much as anyone else. So we have a problem, but what's the solution? And I think we can find it in our Haftarah. Why do you say, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel? My way is hid from God. My cause is ignored by my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The eternal is God from of old, creator of the earth from end to end, who never grows faint or weary, whose wisdom cannot be fathomed, who gives strength to the weary, fresh vigor to the spent. The woodworker encourages the smith. He who flattens with the hammer encourages him who pounds the anvil. He says of the riveting, it is good, and fixes it with nails that it may not topple. When we feel free to discuss and debate and examine the facts, the truth, and we don't try to hide anything or not say what's on our mind so that nobody gets mad at us, we strengthen each other. And different perspectives from different people working on the same scaffolding of what is holy and what is true, they become like rivets and nails in our communal and social bonds. Deceit eats away our communal knowledge, and like mold eats the pages of the book, but truth and honesty strengthens the glue in the spine. So anytime you feel tempted to hide yourself, to withhold the truth, just because you're afraid or maybe even ashamed, I implore all of us, Lech-Lechenu, bring ourselves. All anyone will see is you. Shabbat Shalom.
Sophomore